The grand chamber of the Galactic High Council hummed with a low murmur of laughter, a chorus of arrogance that echoed through the polished obsidian walls. Seated in the center, High Marshal Varric of the Zeventai Imperium leaned forward, his 4 golden eyes gleaming with contemptuous amusement. Before him, a holographic display flickered, showing a rotating image of a blue-green world, Earth.
So these
humans refuse to submit. Varric scoffed, his mandibles clicking in amusement. This is what our scouts were so concerned about? A primitive species with no interstellar capabilities? This is beneath us. A chorus of agreement rippled through the council chamber. The Zeventai had ruled this sector of the galaxy for millennia, conquering countless species with swift, brutal efficiency. Humanity was nothing more than another stubborn ember waiting to be extinguished. Their refusal is not defiance, sneered Minister Tall, his ridged carapace flexing as he gestured at the display. It is ignorance. They don't understand what we are. Once they see our fleets darkening their skies, they will kneel. Varric grinned, exposing serrated fangs. Then let's show them. The command was given. A Zeventai warfleet, a behemoth of imperial might, tore through the fabric of space, exiting hyperspace within Earth's solar system. Carriers the size of cities, bristling with weapons that had reduced entire civilizations to dust, took formation around the unsuspecting planet. The invasion would be swift. A single broadcast was transmitted to every device on Earth, a proclamation spoken in hundreds of languages, its meaning unmistakable. Kneel, and you will be spared. On the bridge of the ISS Indomitable, General Jack Braddock watched the broadcast with a grim expression. The Earthborn officer stood rigid, his steel-gray eyes locked onto the massive fleet displayed on the ship's monitors. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but there was no hesitation in his voice as he turned to his officers. They think we'll break. He exhaled sharply. Let's show them how wrong they are. The response came in the form of silence. No transmissions. No surrender. Just the cold, empty void of space. And then, action. Across Earth, bunkers opened, launching stealth satellites into orbit, hidden weapons platforms that had remained dormant under the guise of civilian infrastructure. Deep space listening stations activated electronic warfare protocols, jamming communications between Zeventai ships. On the ground, marine units mobilized in ghostly efficiency, vanishing into urban strongholds and dense forests, setting traps, preparing. The Zeventai were accustomed to fear. To species that begged for mercy, that surrendered before the first shot was fired. They had never faced an enemy that embraced war. Varric stood aboard the Sovereign Wrath, watching the planet rotate below, irritation creeping into his tone. Why are they not responding? An officer bowed low. We don't know, High Marshal. They have gone silent. A flicker of unease rippled through the command deck. The silence stretched on, thick with something alien, defiance. The invasion order was given. Drop pods screamed through Earth's atmosphere, Imperial soldiers pouring onto the surface in perfect formation. But something was wrong. There were no civilians scrambling in panic. No desperate governments pleading for mercy. The cities stood eerily empty, abandoned. And then, the first shots rang out. In the ruins of a shattered metropolis, an Imperial column moved cautiously through the streets, their heavy footfalls echoing between skeletal buildings. Sergeant Kale of the Zeventai forces adjusted his visor, scanning the silent roads. "This is wrong," he muttered. "Where is everyone?" A single rifle shot cracked through the air. A Zeventai soldier crumpled, his lifeless body hitting the pavement before anyone could react. Panic spread through the ranks. Then another shot. Then another. Shadows moved between the buildings. Silent. Efficient. The Imperials fired blindly, but the enemy never stayed in one place. One by one, Zeventai troops were picked off, confusion turning to fear. Then, the first explosion. A carefully laid trap tore through an entire platoon, bodies flung like ragdolls. Before the smoke cleared, figures in matte black armor emerged from the wreckage, rifles raised. "Contact!" Kale roared, raising his plasma rifle, just as a knife slashed across his throat. A Marine twisted the blade free, Kale's body slumping to the ground. The humans did not fight like the other species. They did not break. They did not flee. They hunted. Word spread quickly through the invading ranks. Whispers of something terrifying. The humans didn't fear war. They were war. On the Sovereign Wrath, Varric listened to the first casualty reports, his mandibles clicking together anxiously. "This is a fluke," he snarled. "Deploy more forces." More troops landed. More vehicles rolled into position. But the same pattern followed. No matter how many they sent, the humans adapted, resisted. A single intercepted transmission, spoken in an emotionless human voice, chilled Varric to his core. "Welcome to Earth." The Zeventai Imperium had never known true resistance. Every world they conquered had crumbled under the weight of their overwhelming force, their fleets blotting out suns, their armies spreading like locusts across trembling civilizations. It was a cycle as old as their empire: arrive, demand surrender, annihilate those who refused. It had always worked. Until now. High Marshal Varric stood in the command chamber of the Sovereign Wrath, his golden eyes locked onto the data scrolling across the holographic display. Reports from the ground detailed an impossible scenario. Entire battalions lost, armored convoys reduced to smoldering wreckage, elite strike teams vanishing into the shadows. How was a primitive species doing this? "They are using guerrilla tactics," sneered Minister Tall, his mandibles twitching in irritation. "Cowards, hiding in ruins like vermin." Varric clenched his fists. He had seen the footage. This was no cowardice. This was precision. Ruthless, efficient, surgical. The Imperium's first mistake had been assuming humanity would kneel. Their second mistake would cost them far more. On the surface, the city of New Haven had become a war zone. A Zeventai armored division rumbled down the skeletal remains of a highway, their war machines designed to break hardened defenses, to crush resistance under sheer firepower. It was supposed to be a show of force, a display of absolute dominance. They never saw it coming. A single figure crouched on a rooftop, watching the convoy through a high-powered scope. His name was Sergeant David Rains, 3rd Marine Recon, and he spoke calmly into his comms. "Convoy sighted. Moving into the kill zone." From hidden positions along the street, Marines adjusted their weapons. Demolition charges lay buried beneath cracked pavement. Sniper teams waited in abandoned buildings. Anti-armor squads remained unseen beneath the wreckage of old vehicles. Every movement was calculated, every breath held in unison. The first explosion tore through the lead vehicle, flipping it onto its back like a helpless insect. Fire erupted, engulfing the street in chaos. The Zeventai responded instantly, their training kicking in as they formed defensive lines, plasma weapons cutting through the air. But their enemy had already disappeared. A squad of Marines emerged from a nearby alley, moving like wraiths through the smoke, their weapons whispering death with each trigger pull. Zeventai soldiers fell before they could react, their massive frames collapsing under a storm of precisely placed rounds. Panic spread through the invading ranks. They had expected a disorganized resistance, a desperate militia fighting with outdated weapons and reckless bravado. Instead, they faced an enemy that moved like a ghost, striking without warning, vanishing before retribution could follow. Varric's voice thundered through the Zeventai comms, his fury barely contained. "Hold your ground. Regroup and—" His command was cut off by another explosion, this one far larger. A well-placed detonation took out an entire supply transport, sending debris raining down like shrapnel. Without supplies, without reinforcements, the Zeventai forces found themselves stranded, surrounded by an enemy that did not fight by their rules. The battle dragged on for hours, the once proud Zeventai soldiers reduced to fractured squads, their movements uncertain, their fear palpable. And then came the final blow. From the shadows, a Marine sniper zeroed in on the enemy commander. A single shot echoed through the night, and the Zeventai officer crumpled, lifeless before he hit the ground. The remaining soldiers hesitated, leaderless, exposed. That hesitation was all the humans needed. When the last gunshot faded into silence, New Haven was no longer contested territory. It belonged to the humans once more. On board the Sovereign Wrath, Varric's claws dug into the armrests of his throne. He had underestimated them. Gravely. This was no minor rebellion. This was war. And the Zeventai were not prepared for it. The bridge of the sovereign wrath was silent, save for the faint hum of data streams feeding casualty reports into the main holodisplay. High Marshal Varric's golden eyes swept across the figures. Entire regiments lost, supply lines severed, outposts wiped out in precision strikes. The humans were no longer just resisting. They were hunting. His claws flexed against the armrest of his command throne. Never had the Imperium faced an enemy that struck with such surgical brutality. The humans fought without hesitation, without mercy. They exploited every weakness, turned every oversight into a massacre. And worst of all, they adapted. A crimson warning flared across the screen. Another fleet ambushed. Another squadron obliterated. Varric turned to his war minister. How? His voice was a quiet growl, but it carried the weight of his fury. How are they predicting our movements? Minister Tall hesitated, his mandibles clicking anxiously. They do not fight like other species. Their kind does not adhere to conventional doctrine. The ship's warning klaxons howled before he could finish. A sudden jolt rocked the sovereign rat, sending officers stumbling. Emergency lights flickered as the ship's shields flared against an unexpected assault. "Incoming fire!" a tactical officer shouted. Multiple human warships, fast-moving, highly coordinated. The main viewport erupted in fire. The humans had arrived. The fleet that emerged from the void was unlike anything the Zeventai had expected. Not in size or power, but in sheer, calculated aggression. Human warships didn't follow standard engagement patterns. They didn't posture, didn't maneuver for intimidation. They struck with ruthless precision, targeting engines, communication relays, and power grids. Varric's voice rang out. "Return fire. Deploy the full fleet. I want them annihilated." The Zeventai vessels responded, unleashing torrents of plasma and ionized destruction. The void between them turned into a storm of fire. And yet, the humans were relentless. Aboard the USS Titan, Admiral Calloway watched the battlefield unfold. His fleet wasn't the largest. It wasn't the most technologically advanced. But it was the deadliest force humanity had ever assembled. His expression remained cold, calculating. He had studied the Zeventai. He knew how they fought, and he knew how to break them. "Bring the retribution around their flank," he commanded. "I want their flagship isolated." The order was carried out with terrifying efficiency. The retribution, a heavily modified dreadnought, surged forward, cutting through enemy formations with ruthless firepower. The Zeventai fleet faltered as their lines broke, their discipline crumbling under the onslaught. On board the Sovereign Wrath, Varric realized too late what was happening. The humans weren't just fighting them. They were dismantling them. A direct impact sent the command chamber into chaos. The ship's stabilizers faltered, emergency sirens screaming in protest. Varric braced himself as the bridge lurched violently. The humans had targeted their command systems, leaving them blind, crippled. Admiral Calloway's voice crackled through the comms, cold and resolute. "High Marshal Varric, your forces are defeated. Surrender, or we finish this." For the first time in his long career, Varric hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of a dawning realization. He had underestimated humanity. And now, it was humanity's turn to strike back. Varric stared at the smoking ruins of his once mighty fleet, his claws tightening against the cold metal of the command console. The Sovereign Wrath was adrift, her once impenetrable shields reduced to flickering embers against the black void. Across the battlefield, Zeventai warships burned, their wreckage scattered like broken bones. Humanity had done the unthinkable. The comms crackled again. "High Marshal Varric," Admiral Calloway's voice was steady, carrying the weight of absolute control. "This is your last chance. Stand down." Varric's mandibles clenched, his pride warring against the undeniable truth before him. The Zeventai Imperium had ruled the galaxy for centuries, crushing any species that dared defy its might. And yet, in mere months, these humans had turned the tide. Not with superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but with cunning. With unyielding ferocity. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Surrender was unthinkable. But he saw no path to victory. Tall, his war minister, limped to his side, one arm clutching a deep wound across his torso. Marshal, we must retreat. Retreat. Another bitter taste. Another humiliation. Varric exhaled sharply, his decision made. Order what remains of our forces to fall back. Across the fractured fleet, Zeventai ships disengaged, their battered hulls retreating into the void. The battle was over. But humanity was not finished. Admiral Calloway watched as the Zeventai forces attempted to escape, his expression unreadable. "Fire at will," he ordered. The USS Titan and her fleet unleashed one final, devastating salvo. Zeventai cruisers exploded in rapid succession, their retreat turning into a rout. Varric barely had time to react before the Sovereign Wrath shuddered violently. Consoles burst into flames, alarms howling in agony. The ship was lost. He turned to Tall, his voice resolute. "Get to the escape pods." "And you?" Varric glanced at the burning remnants of his empire. "I will not flee." The command bridge ruptured as a final blast tore through the ship. The High Marshal of the Zeventai Imperium closed his eyes as the fire consumed him. On the USS Titan, Calloway stood in silence as the Sovereign Wrath was reduced to glowing debris. The battle was over, but the war had only begun. Humanity had not just survived. They had risen.